in the First World War, and they went to the Ideals Homes exhibition in the early 1920s and bought what in America would be known as a tract house, a development very near Slough, where the office was set, and it was a bungalow, a very modern bungalow, a bungalow that my wife's paternal grandfather was very attracted to because he had experienced living in bungalows in India for the first time, and this was part of a broader suburban development. And there they could indulge in things like gardening and DIY and listening to the wireless. These were all considered the new type of quiet domestic pleasures of family life that began to emerge in the 1920s and 1930s. So some images to make this come alive a little. On your left you have I should just say the main companies involved in the construction of these sites, many of which were built actually by small-time builders who would just build one or two houses, but there were also these big companies, Costa and Wimpey and Ideal Homestead, building much larger developments. And here you can see a brochure from Ideal Homesteads for one of their model houses, and here you see one of the larger suburban estates in Lewisham in South London. A couple of other images just to bring home how important this is. This is a slightly complicated graph, but it's basically the number of new dwellings built per year per 1,000 people. What I want you to grasp is that this period, from 1918 up to 1939, is a period of massive development of Britain's housing stock. Indeed, it's matched in the period after the Second World War for longer, but much of Britain's housing stock continues to have been built at this time. If you drive anywhere around Britain, you will come across these homes built in the 1920s and 1930s. The other graph I have here is basically showing you the distinction between public housing that you can see here, down here, and then the uptake of private housing in the years from 1925. Now, the problem with suburban development was, of course, that it was built on the countryside, and it was built in chaotic, unplanned types of ways. And so it is interestingly in the 1920s that you get the development of a rural preservation movement in Britain, trying to protect the countryside from the encroachment of these new, unplanned suburban developments. And the key organisation here, still going strong, was the Council for the Protection of Rural England, which was responsible for the publication of this book, England and the Octopus of Development, which showed that something like 50,000 acres of British countryside was being lost every year. And to the preservationists, this represented a loss of the very fabric of the countryside that they thought was the spiritual essence of Britain, and the place where Britons could recover from the turmoil of war. They just didn't want people actually living there. It was okay for people to visit, but it wasn't okay for them to live in what they considered ugly suburban developments. But the countryside wasn't just about suburban development. It was also about popular pastimes. And those people who couldn't afford to buy the new suburban houses, or who weren't living in the new public housing estates on the fringes of cities, began to go out to the countryside to ramble many weekends. Rambling in Britain is basically the equivalent of hiking in the United States. The Youth Hostel Association, formed in 1930, was a key part of this explosion of interest in discovering and encountering the countryside by working people. It had 300 hostels by 1939 and 83,000 members. It provided cheap accommodation, cheap communal accommodation very often, for people who could not afford to either stay in bed and breakfast or in hotels. And indeed the bed and breakfast industry began to develop in this period. It was at this point that people began to take in strangers into their houses to make money, not least because, as we'll see on Thursday, the countryside was considering agriculture was in a very bad way at all. So many people who lived in the countryside needed alternative forms of income. Now, the problem was that even though was that land ownership, as you'll remember from the 19th century, continued to be dominated by a very remarkably few number of aristocratic owners. And so people walking out in the countryside were often, despite the existence of public footpaths that often went back centuries, were often driven off the land by gamekeepers and wardens on aristocratic estates. So in 1932, Kinder Scout, which is this image that you see before you, and Kinder Scout is basically between Manchester and Sheffield in the Peak District. Indeed, I used to live pretty much just over this hill here. They organised a mass trespass in which hundreds of people broke across the fences and said, look, this land is unused and we are taking ownership of it. This land belongs to the people. It shouldn't be confined simply to the aristocracy wanting to shoot their grouse. This mass trespass becomes hugely important because it becomes one of the building blocks for the taking the development of public lands in Britain and the creation of the national park system in Britain after the Second World War. So the point that I'm trying to make here is working people also have this lust to be out in the countryside and to be able to recuperate and regenerate themselves after the war. Any questions on any of that stuff before I move into the second half of this lecture? Melody? Right. Council tax has basically always existed. That is to say that there's always been a local property tax that was known as rates. Okay, so whatever parish you lived in, or whatever municipal borough you lived in, you paid rates that supported what local government did, and that had existed pretty much time out of mind. I mean, certainly back into the 17th century and further back. The council tax that you're referring to, I think, was an invention that came in the early 1990s and was an attempt to try and reform local forms of taxation. But basically, much of the construction of public housing came out of local municipal funds that were supplemented by federal state funds. Okay, it was a sort of compact between the central state and local taxation. Okay, so let me move into the politics of this so-called introspective term. You can see that part of what I'm trying to say here, or part of what it is that several historians have argued about this period, is that there's a conservative turn. This introspective turn, this fascination with England and the countryside and remaking family and domestic relations was conservative with a small c. Okay? But it's also the case that the Conservative Party became the dominant force in Britain in the 1920s and the 1930s. And this was a pretty remarkable development, or a surprising development. No one expected that the point in which Britain would finally become a democratic state in 1918 and 1928, where still 70% of the population was working class, no one believed that working class electorate would return conservative governments. Remember, the Conservative Party throughout the 19th century had represented primarily the defence of aristocratic interests, even though in the 1870s it had embraced social reform at home, the protection of British jobs, and an aggressive imperial agenda to try and be attractive to working people. Nonetheless, everybody expected that when the working people got the vote, that they would vote for the Labour Party, which began to basically displace the Liberal Party as the principal party of opposition in the 1920s. Indeed, the Labour Party had its first administration in 1924. This was the way in which people expected political history to develop, that the Labour Party would now be in power ceaselessly because of the working class nature of the franchise. But that doesn't happen. Instead, the Conservative Party is basically hegemonic throughout the 1920s and the 1930s. How does this happen? Well, it happens by the Conservative Party very skillfully rebranding itself, reinventing itself around this key figure, Stanley Baldwin. Stanley Baldwin, who is Prime Minister between 1923 and 24, again at the end of 1924 through to 1929, again between 1935 and 1937, and is Deputy Prime Minister in a national government formed after the economic crisis of 1931 through to 1935. Stanley Baldwin is the dominant political figure of the 1920s and the 1930s. He is, if you like, the Gladstone of the early 20th century. And interestingly, what Baldwin does is try and adopt that Gladstonian mantle. That is to say, the Conservative Party that had argued against free trade, cheap government, well, that's a lie. They hadn't argued against cheap government, but they had begun to argue against free trade, and had argued against the expansion of the franchise, began to project itself as the party that would defend the constitutional rights of Britain and would become the fiscally responsible party. Remember, Gladstone's whole thing was about retrenchment, cheap government. Part of this was made possible, of course, by the dramatic costs of the First World War. Britain's national debt, which you remember, had been huge at the end of the Napoleonic Wars and then had been gradually cut down to almost nothing by the beginning of the 20th century, mushroomed in the period during the war. It was 706 million in 1914. It grew to 7.5 million in 1918. And indeed, it continued to grow throughout the interwar period for reasons I'll explain on Thursday. So the first thing that Baldwin and the Conservative Party did was to say we have to get control of the national debt. And so therefore, from 1922 to 1923, they begin a process of major retrenchment in government expenditure. In 1925, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, a person that you'll probably have heard of, Winston Churchill, also decides that Britain must return to the gold standard. Okay? Remember, the gold standard had been basically suspended at the outbreak of the First World War. It was believed by Churchill that restoring Britain to the gold standard would restore its pre-war eminence in global trade. But doing so was only possible thanks to American loans. A loan of $200 million from the US Federal Reserve and $100 million by the merchant bank JP Morgan. Churchill's big mistake, and there were several, but arguably his biggest mistake was to decide that Britain had to return to the gold standard at its pre-war levels, which was basically at almost $5 to the pound, even though the value of the pound had fallen as low as 3.4 in 1920. But symbolically, the return of Britain to the gold standard at its pre-war level was meant to restore the British economy to its previous height and dominance. Also, the Conservative Party continued just about to hold on to the belief of the free trade. There had been those in the Conservative Party that had argued for the importance of protection from Chamberlain on in the first decade of the 20th century, but Baldwin managed to keep them at bay. That the system of imperial tariffs and imperial protection that Chamberlain and his followers had argued for didn't come to fruition until 1931. So in many ways, the Conservative Party takes on the key elements of that the Liberal Party had been so insistent upon for much of the 19th century. The other thing that makes Baldwin highly effective as a winner of elections was his idea that he could restore stability, political stability to Britain. And this in the context, basically, of the threat of Bolshevism. So the Russian Revolution in 1917 hung a big shadow after post-war British politics in Britain. Not that the influence of the Conservative Party, the Communist Party, was really of any importance until the end of the 1920s, 1930s. But in the Conservative imagination, there were Reds under just about every bed. And so in 1924, the Daily Mail publishes this famous Zinoviev letter showing that the British Labour Party is under direct control from the Kremlin. This, of course, in the run-up to the election of 1924. During the General Strike of 1926, which I'll explain to you on Thursday, Baldwin and Churchill are highly effective in mobilizing people against the industrial chaos that resulted. And they did so basically by arguing that people had to rally behind the defense of the Constitution, that the unions were holding the country to ransom, and that this was highly damaging, that it was the British government that should run the nation. And they rallied what they called the constitutional classes. That is to say, the people who weren't part of the organized labour movement. So people like my grandfather, you'll remember from the last lecture, who fought in the First World War, rallied in defence of the nation as a special constable. Many special constables were sworn in to supplement the ranks of the army on the streets. And here he gets his special letter from Stanley Baldwin thanking him for his service to the nation. So there is a major labour crisis and the threat of Bolshevism that Baldwin promises to hold at bay. But there are also a series of other crises that Baldwin is highly effective at being able to show himself to be the best manager of. So there's the enormous financial crisis in 1931, and then there is the abdication crisis in 1936, when the future of the British monarchy seems to be at risk because of the pernicious influence of an American divorcee, of American women, really. For all of this, Baldwin has this mantra of safety first, okay, that Britain has to stay safe, business as normal, and the constitution and the economy must run in the same old ways. The last part of this jigsaw puzzle is the imperial picture. Now, if these conservatives are right, that there is a turn away from the old masculine, adventurous imperial rhetoric that had characterized the militarism of the late Victorian and Edwardian period, then you would expect to see the British Empire taking a much less visible place in British politics and in the British imagination. In fact, the very opposite happens. In 1919, after the Treaty of Versailles, the British Empire is at the height of its strength and power. Measured in terms of its territory and population, it's the largest it will ever be. It covered 13 million square miles and included over 450 million people. And that expansion was due to the dark red areas on this map, here, here, and here, which was the mandate areas that were established by the Treaty of Versailles, where basically Britain and France divided up the former imperial territories of the Ottoman Empire and the German Empire. So Britain has mandate territories in the Middle East, in Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq, and in Africa, in East Africa, in Tanganyika, here, in the British Cameroons, and in Togoland as well. In fact, the Cameroons and Togoland were split between the British, and there was a French Cameroons and French Togoland as well. So certainly in terms of territory, the British Empire is in very good shape in 1919. But everything was not rosy in the British imperial garden by any way. The First World War had been an imperial war. That is to say, it had been fought by imperial troops. Remember, something like 250,000 colonial troops died in the service of defending the British Empire during the First World War. And for many colonial people, this service, this defense of the motherland in the First World War, provided one important claim to independence, or to new forms of political recognition within the British Empire. They had done their imperial duty. They now expected a certain flow of rights to come, just as the British people had themselves received a vote as reward for their efforts during the Great War. Indeed, you see here a picture of a Caribbean regiment in France. But that doesn't happen, or it happens very falteringly. And in 1919, there are a series of revolts and revolutions across the British Empire. In Iraq, in Egypt, Ireland, India, Afghanistan, and Somaliland, and a whole series of very important strikes across the Caribbean. Many of these were emboldened by the Wilsonian rhetoric of self-determination in the run-up to Versailles. Many of them were, of course, abandoned by that very same rhetoric. That is to say, self-determination for Wilson was something that was, shall we say, unevenly applied. So colonial subjects receive a type of double whammy after the First World War. They think they've done their duty, so therefore they should get some basic rights in return from the British. They think that Wilson is going to offer a new model of international self-determination, and it doesn't happen. So the British Empire returns to its tried and tested techniques of imperial governance, a splash of reform, and a good dose of repression to keep everything in order. Let me talk first about the repression. And I'll do this. I can't cover everywhere, so I'm just going to talk about Ireland, India, and Iraq. In Ireland, after the Rising in 1916, the first election to the Irish Parliament came in 1918. And there, Sinn Féin, which was campaigning for the declaration of an Irish Republic, won the majority of seats at that election, 73 out of 105 seats. The dominant victory. And Sinn Féin declared a republic. At that same time, there starts basically a type of colonial war in which Irish volunteers, or the Irish Republican Army, the military wing of Sinn Féin, start attacks on the Royal Irish Constabulary, the Anglo-Irish police force. The British government obviously refuses to recognise the republic declared by Sinn Féin and brings in its own military units known as the Black and Tans, many of whom were recruited as veterans from the First World War, to join the Royal Irish Constabulary